Why should the reasons that these colonies were founded matter to us at all? Why study those reasons 400 years later? Why should we even care? Well, it's much more important to your everyday life than you think it is. You see, anything that you do in your life, the direction that that thing will take can be linked directly back to the foundations that you laid for it when you began. Because the foundations that you lay in your endeavors speak directly to you as a person, to your values, your goals, what's most important to you. This is going to become very clear to you by the end of this video, so hang tight. Let's take a look at the foundations that the colonies were built upon and see if we can draw some kind of connection between those foundations and the path that they took. Let's start with Jamestown. First, these were all men, so no women and no families. It would be almost 15 years before the first real influx of women arrive in Jamestown, which only happened because they literally paid women to come be wives for the men in Jamestown. You would have to agree that this would definitely push the focus of the Jamestown colony more towards certain things, right? Things like adventurism, building, competition, wealth, power. The Jamestown colony was the brainchild of a group of wealthy investors in Britain. So this venture was exclusively about making money, and all of the men who signed up for those early trips were interested in gaining land and creating wealth. So based on those foundations, it's not surprising really that this colony expanded to a larger area and became very profitable. Given its foundations, those outcomes are quite predictable. It's not surprising that they developed cash crops like tobacco, rice, and cotton. It's not surprising that many new innovations flowed from this area. It's not surprising that this colony required much more manpower and labor, and therefore indentured servitude would have been a very important part of the colony, and that would eventually lead to a demand for slaves to be imported. It's also not surprising that, being more secular than the colonies in the north, that Jamestown would focus more on law and government, that they would create the first legislative assembly in the Americas and lay the foundations of individual rights and the constitutional protection of those rights. Now, the other two colonies in New England were not settled by the Pilgrims and the Puritans principally for creating wealth, as we discussed in the last episode. They were settled by people who were looking for a place where they can worship their God in the manner of their choosing without interference from the government. These colonies were settled by families with children. Even many of the passengers who were not separatists, who came over on the Mayflower, came with their families. On the Mayflower, 31 of the 102 passengers were children. That's a third of the passengers were children. There were 28 females, even one very pregnant woman who gave birth during the voyage. And the people who continued to come on ship after ship were families with children. This is a stark contrast to a colony that for almost 15 years was made up exclusively of men down in Jamestown. These New England colonies then did not attract the types of wealth and adventure seekers that Virginia attracted, obviously. The northern colonies, therefore, did not require the huge labor force that Jamestown did in order to sustain it. So slavery never became a need, a necessity in the north like it did in Virginia. Also, the religious nature of the northern colonies, the religious foundations of those colonies, have a natural resistance to slavery. Both of those reasons can help explain why the abolitionist movement began in the northern colonies by religious people. This is why the reasons that the colonies were founded are so important. because it tells us everything about why they developed in the way that they did. With an understanding of their foundations and a dash of critical thinking, you could predict, without ever actually knowing the historical truth of how these colonies turned out, you could predict their paths with pretty reasonable accuracy, I would say. And this is why we study history. If knowing the foundational values of something helps you to be able to predict where that thing is going to lead based on those foundations, then you can apply that to almost anything in society and to anything in your own life. You see, the foundations that you and I lay in our own ventures that we undertake in our lives will determine the path that those ventures will take. In the same way that the foundations that the colonies were built on determine the paths that they took. So we need to be more aware and conscious of that when we set out in our lives to build and create things. I'll give you a couple of very simple examples, things that you might be able to relate to, if not right now, in the very near future. If you grow up and choose a career that is focused on creating wealth and power, don't be surprised when you struggle in that field, because maybe you are a more compassionate and understanding person and take that approach toward the way you do your job. If you start a family on the foundation of one-person rule, you are the unquestioned authority, and nobody else in the family is allowed any independence and autonomy, then don't be surprised if your family turns against you. If your teacher assigns you to a work group in school, and you set it up as an every person for himself kind of situation, don't be surprised when no one wants to help each other out, and your group produces a lower quality result than the other groups do. And if you decide to be part of a political party that is based on strict adherence to a certain ideology, with no room for nuance or dissenting opinion, well, don't be surprised when you are banished and ostracized by that party because you dared say something that goes against the party's accepted beliefs.